I'm Chris. I have a background in technology, but really for the last 3 years particularly, I've been very interested in collaboration and communication and people, and also maybe learning a little bit about leadership. So 3 years ago, I started forming guilds, and I ended up forming literally dozens of them and facilitating pretty much hundreds of sessions over about a 3-year period. Starting off in technology, but then moving into other things, including, areas of the business and HR and such like. I did a lot of blogging about it. I went through, I suppose, a personal journey of discovery. And I also, in that process, met loads of interesting people and found out a lot about the types of things that I was stumbling into with my practice, trying to actually build guilds. So this is really a story of my story, and really showing some things about what I've actually found out. I'm just slightly thrown by not being able to change the Zoom settings, but never mind. Okay, so if I move on, right. So in our organizational practice, we often have a number of things that we encounter. We might encounter the idea of power structures, this idea of maybe somebody has an authority over something, organizational structures. We even may have the idea of rules, and we may have people who follow rules and people who want to follow the rules, but they can't. We might have frustration. We might have a amount of deviation. And I suppose this for me, warrants asking a number of questions. Are our organizations really optimized for this adaptation that is required for digital transformation and all of the other things we have to worry about? Are our needs being met? How do we determine whose needs get met first? How do we mitigate failure? And how really do we understand how to make our organizations more humanistic? Do they match the nature of the human condition or not? And if they don't, if they did, what would that actually look like? So that's really, those are the sort of questions that I have in mind. So what's a guild? So a guild, you could say it's a cultural agility startup with an organization, but it's basically a community of practice around hot topics. So you could say like the British Computer Society almost is like a guild, or if you had the British Medical Association, it could be some things that are, I suppose, super organizational. So you might have somebody who's in charge of heart surgery at a particular hospital, but what about heart surgery as a topic, regardless of which hospital you're in or even which country you're in? It's like maybe some people are interested in that. Well, that's a community of practice, the practice being heart surgery. So the next thing is they tend to be independent of the organization and run by the membership, and as such they're semi-detached maybe from, they're a different type of organizational paradigm, maybe less hierarchical, or not hierarchical in the same way. There's no reporting lines in the guild. Nobody gets a review at the end of the year or even a pay rise. They're typically unstructured. This is maybe the approach that I've taken. Some people like to do structure. I quite like the idea of things that are unstructured because they can maybe lead to emergent self-organizing dynamics. There's typically an emphasis on learning and growth, and they're facilitated rather than led, and I'll talk a bit more about what that actually means. So the big idea then is that when we collaborate, and let's face it, we do an awful lot of collaboration, to actually get anything, remarkable done in our working life and in our home lives as well. So some things get in the way. Maybe org structures can help with that, but they can also hinder, as can things like job titles, I would argue, pay grades and egos, because they can distort this notion of, well, who's in charge, or how do we lead, how do we solve something together? it actually, I would argue that sometimes these things can be very, very helpful, but other times they can emphasize maybe some of the challenges around, say, Eric Burns' transactional analysis. We may get an issue where you've got one up, one down. Maybe there's this thing that's called the drama triangle, which is, Burns' idea of transactional analysis is the idea that people inherit this or embody this, either a parent, an adult, or a child during a dialogue, and it's better if you get an adult rather than adult child. So the reason for that is that they suppress a sort of a natural way of communication that's maybe built on maybe more mutuality and empathy. So what we do in Guilds is we try and leave those dynamics at the door. So we emphasize the relationship building. I've got something about trim tabs here. So basically a trim tab is a little surface on an aeroplane that is very small, but it keeps the rudder or the aileron in place. And I would argue that Guilds are a bit like that. There's something very small that can have a very magnifying effect on an agile or a cultural digital transformation. So really that's the simple idea, that it's almost like another organizational paradigm within maybe a host organization. So the origins of guilds, obviously there were like the Venetian craft guilds, that were set up for mutual aid and protection. If I made cutlery and somebody else made cutlery, then although we might be competing with each other as cutlery makers, there's also maybe some mutual interest that we have, and that's why guilds were put together. There's also Spotify famously have spoken about guilds, and they've maybe they've maybe moved on from that a little bit, but then the idea is that they've got rather like these sort of common interests, that they divide their organization up into tribes and chapters and things like that. And the idea is the guild then stitches those together, rather like the Cutlery Makers Guild. My own personal journey has been very heavily influenced by group therapy, and I have been involved in group therapy as a participant, and I wanted to recreate some of those dynamics, which are very much around psychological safety. There's no rush to talk, everybody's equal, everybody supports each other, that sort of thing. And this also relates maybe to some modern organizational practices around Teal and Holacracy, and I'll talk about what they mean a bit later on in the presentation. Any points or questions so far? I mean, we're just about to get into the meat of it, but if there is anything, Arthur, then let me know. If not, I'll carry on.
We don't have any questions currently, but I'll let you know if there are. Okay,
thanks. So what are guilds good for and what they're not good for? They're not necessarily the place for mainstream planning and delivery, because they tend to be, the unstructured approach doesn't necessarily lend itself to that directly, but they often influence that, because guilds are excellent for creating, effectively making sense of the world in a group context. So they're great for understanding strategy, culture change, new ideas, trying to get to the bottom of some complex root causes to problems that might involve people, process, and technology. They're great at dealing with the politics. They're great at actually getting a sense of community spirit and getting everybody involved in all the stakeholders, regardless of where they sit in the organization, to feel that they're part of something. So as you can see, those things are excellent and can then influence very strongly the mainstream planning and delivery. So often we found there was a dynamic in the guilds that we set up whereby we would do almost like a lot of the group sense making and the thinking in the guilds. We would then even create some collateral. So they're very good for crowdsourcing. So if I created a strategy, my job title, official job title was enterprise architect, but rather than me writing a document and then everybody saying I wasn't involved, I don't agree, I would then write a scrappy document, take it into the guilds really early, and then we would basically, as a community, we would create something, and then everybody buys into it. So it actually meant we ended up with a better quality deliverable than if I'd done it myself. And politically, it sits much better because everybody's got skin in the game. So that's an idea of, you know, some of the things that they're good for. And ultimately, these things require trust. And it's a bit of a busy slide here, but if I just kind of talk about some of the points, and then I'll sort of go through this. Google have done a quite a well-researched piece of work on team performance, and psychological safety is the factor that they've discovered through their research that is the biggest predictor of team performance. And therefore, psychological safety needs to be understood. It often can be understood in terms of trust. Trust is a very simple word, but it's actually quite a complex topic. Trust is the idea of, is based around vulnerability, actually. Often we trust people. It means that we're actually making ourselves vulnerable, and if we trust them, we're able to, you know, they're choosing not to take advantage of us. So it builds that sense of mutuality. So Brené Brown, who some people may well know, popularizes a lot of things around trust. And she's got this braving model: boundaries, reliability, accountability, and so on and so forth. And what I thought was interesting, I did a little blog about this, but what I did is I found this, because I'm interested in metaphors between machines and networks and people and psychology. So if you take the, you know, Claude Shannon's work on networks, and he's got this like model of a network, which if you ignore all my junk, it's basically just the boxes and the lines. You've got this information source, transmitter transmits a signal over a channel, there's noise, receiver, and then it's actually, you know, destination. So what I thought was interesting is, could I fit the Brené Brown braving ideas to the Shannon Weaver information model? And of course they fit really well. So what that points to is that trust is actually introduces error corrections into our human network. If we trust each other, I can say the wrong thing and you'll interpret my intent and understand what I've said. If I say the right thing but we don't trust each other, then you might interpret it incorrectly. So what I'm really saying is that, in my view, trust is actually a fundamental asset to any type of collaboration, and it should be highly valued. And if it doesn't exist, the first thing to do is to understand why and to try and build that up. It's also, as people may know, trust is built up very slowly. It can be lost very quickly. I'll just bring in just a shout out to a friend and colleague of mine, J. Brian Hennessy. So Brian does a lot of work around insight and aha moments, and the idea of the human singularity, which he's interested in. So he's very interested in the idea of everybody is unique, but we're also kind of, we often don't know what our unique talents are. And what we need to do is to actually go on a voyage of discovery to find out what everybody's great at, what everybody's born to do. We need to do that within a trustful environment, and we need to actually be able to experiment to do that. And I would argue that guilds allow us to do that. They allow us to let go, which is another term Brian uses, and actually just explore things, because we don't have the pressure of structure, agenda, delivery, and things like that. And the guilds, again, the ones that I've run, they typically ran once a week, so it was about an hour a week. So that space was then receptive. It allowed people to develop themselves and their personal relationships in relation typically to the topic of the guild. A little bit about organizations as networks. So really here, there's nice quote by a biologist that I can't see because my screen's covered in Zoom windows. But basically, there's
so it quote, says gradually the observer realizes that these organisms are connected to each other, not linearly, but in a net-like entangled fabric. And that's from Alexander von Humboldt.
Thank you, Arthur. So I'm reading a book called Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, which is all about the secret life of fungi. and fungi are the expert networkers in the world. You know, the wood wide web has been there like millions of years before the internet. So the interesting then is that we are a network, and any org structure then necessarily creates a schism, a bit like a code base. If I find any way of organizing something, any way I organize something always creates disorganization somewhere else. You know, the example could be if I structure an organization by line of business, like vertically, then the shared functions, like say IT or marketing, or they get split. But if I organize it by those, then the lines of business get split. I can't have both. It's a bit like, you know, wanting food that's, you know, they talk about this cliche around food that's both cheap, good, and fast, and you have to pick two. It's the same type of thing with org structures. There's no such thing as a perfect org structure. So if we accept that, what that means is that any org structure basically has got a flaw built into it. And I would argue that guilds are a way of actually saying, well, knowing that, let's then create effectively guilds as an informal network and org structure to repair the damage that the formal org structure necessarily has created. There's no way of avoiding that, if you imagine. So there's a guy called Harold Jarsch who talks about leadership is making the network smarter. And as a guild leader, what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to say, well, what shape has the org structure? How might that have broken a few things? How can we then use guilds to try and mend the things that it's by necessity broken? The idea is that we're then moving towards an organization that is really, it's moving towards its potentiation, its potential. So it's actually able to outperform an organization that's not addressing those flaws. So this relates to ideas that are covered by theorists like Niels Flaging. There's ideas around organizational physics, which is this idea you've got the formal org structure, you've got the social network of, you know, carpooling and water coolers, which is obviously much harder in the pandemic era where everybody's on Zoom, and then you've got maybe value creational networks. So Flaging organizational physics is talking about the fact that there's more networks in play than just the formal hierarchy, and that's really what I'm riffing on. Niall Ferguson, in his book The Square and the Tower, talks about the interplay between hierarchies and networks through history, and he gives examples of the American Revolution, where it was the membership of the Scottish Freemasons, of people like Paul Revere and George Washington, that gave them the network they needed to then, you know, foment the American Revolution and to, you know, form the beginning of the American Republic. So over time, hierarchies and networks, they're in a dance, but broadly speaking, networks are more adaptive than hierarchies. Hierarchies tend to then form after a network has done its adaptation. So if people are doing any transformational activities, they should be thinking networks over hierarchies. And then once it's stabilized, then, you know, the hierarchies come in to optimize that stability, if you see what I mean. And this is really, really interesting, because what this says then is that hierarchies distort information. They distort the flow of information necessarily. If you think a tree as a hierarchy, it's trying to make sure the flow of nutrients and other things happen in a certain way that's good for the tree. Now the issue then is that sometimes those flows are not good for the tree. You know, it may be that that tree needs to die and another tree needs to grow in its place. You know, an organization needs to reinvent itself. And that's where hierarchies can sometimes get in the way. And it doesn't mean we abandon them necessarily. Some people experiment with that. It's more that they need to be supplemented with networks. So dissolving boundaries is really what we're doing then in the guilds, which is increasing and diversifying flow. Just the mushroom picture this is something again from the Sheldrake book I read. So the psychedelic mushrooms are being used to, and go with me on this, they're being used to treat depression. And one of the interesting things that they do, apparently, is how they work is they just turn off the default mode network, which is our just if nothing else happening, it's our brain's default cycle. That's all they do. they disable that, and then the network reconfigures around it. And that's kind of, to some extent, what we're doing in guilds. What we're saying is the hierarchy, for the purposes of the guild session, those things don't matter. And then what happens is that there's that renewal and growth that can increase opportunities, for further exploration. Any points on that? I'm going to go on to some examples very, very soon.
Okay, we do have not entirely following on from the points you're making there. Fantastic points, though. Loads to unpack. But there's a question from David Norfolk, which says, "Do sociopathic people ever game guild structures for their own ends?"
Yeah, I mean, people can always take advantage of guilds, but it's going to be very obvious, because the idea, as I'll go later, in terms of forming your own guild, you need a creed, and you need, rather like whether it's to do with group therapy or Alcoholics Anonymous, you repeat the creed, and then if people are violating that creed and violating that trust, it becomes obvious. And I think that is important. So, for example, as a guild founder, I got to the point where I did gain some personal empowerment and even power to an extent. I learned an awful lot. I knew a lot. Bacon, knowledge is power. I needed to. I was faced with the moral dilemma of actually, I needed to make sure I kept myself honest and not use that power in a way that was for me personally. I wanted to give that back to the organization. But they are, networks are powerful. And guilds are, can get powerful, and that can then cause pathologies, because power is attractive, it's seductive, isn't it? So yeah. If I just go on very quickly then to flow. So we've gotten to the topic of flow. So very quickly, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, Hungarian guy, I think, did the work on psychological flow. At the individual level, the idea is that you've got challenge ranging from low to high, skill level low to high, and the idea is we've got a number of different states we can be in, and it's really nice to be in the top right. And indeed, it's a visceral thing. We know when we're in a flow state, it feels good, whether it's a sparkling conversation or we have a skill that we're good at and we've got a challenge which is, commensurate to our skill, and we're thriving. Many people, not everybody, but many people have experienced areas of, flow in their life. Not always, but when we experience it, we know it. It's a subjective feeling. One thing's interesting then is if we take that to the group level, if we look at the picture on the right, suddenly it gets more complicated, because maybe for me to flow, it means maybe you're not flowing because I like things a certain way, you like things another way. Maybe I'm more of a I'm more of a structured person, and you're a kind of experiment and iterate person, whatever it might be. So the point I'm making then is that guilds can be a way of us experimenting with flow in a group context rather than individual. How do we get a flow of conversation, a flow of ideas? And I would argue that's often about this principle of mutuality, the idea of just let's respect everybody's contribution. Everybody's kind of equal in the guild. We try and deconstruct then experts, non-experts, and then what we get is this consensual, collegiate conversation that then just starts to sparkle and grow, and it's palpable. Very much some of the best times I've had in my professional career have been in guild sessions, and people, after a good one, people are, wow, that was amazing. It can be, and it's all there. The human potential is all there. The point I'm making then is often the formal organizational structures that we have, great though they are, that they can overly shape the way people interact, and people can interact in far more subtle and interesting ways than that. I won't go into this great detail. This is Adrian Bejan's work on constructal law, but Adrian's basically saying information is shaped in trees, regardless of whether it's a tree or a heat sink for a chip or a snowflake or an economy. And he calls these things flow systems, and they're evolving to optimize the currents that run through them. And the point I'm making then is that org structures are optimizing some of the currents at the expense of the others. So we need networks like guilds and other things to actually optimize the other currents that are being maybe subdued by the formal structure, and it's unavoidable. As you can imagine, it's unavoidable. As soon as I shape something, I'm not shaping all of the other things. So really what we're trying to do is we're trying to diversify the flow of information and ideas and sense making within an organization. This is a very busy slide. Apologies for this. It's a diagram I've taken from Meeting Magic, but this is really talking about Frederic Laloux's Reinventing Organisations. Now, Laloux did work on this based on him studying self-organizational companies like Buurtzorg. Buurtzorg is and my pronunciation is probably wrong, but it's basically it's from the Netherlands, formed by a guy called Jos de Blok, who's a ex-community nurse. Jos found that nursing after privatization, community nursing was very poor. Loads of, you get people with Alzheimer's with like a barcode on their door and being seen by 20 professionals, medical professionals over the course of a month. Is that going to be good for an Alzheimer's patient? No. Accountants think it's completely fine because it makes sense to somebody. And he thought there must be a better way. So he formed Buurtzorg. It's all run by the nurses. They deal with the rostering, they deal with supplies. They've got 10,000 people and only 49 of them are not nurses. And it's actually very successful in the marketplace across at least 3 countries. And the outcomes for the patients is much better. The accountants would not like it at all, because you've got nurses having tea when they should be spending their 10 minutes allotted time to give somebody an injection. But the reality is not only they're doing well on the market. If somebody has a Buurtzorg nurse, they spend less time in hospital compared to somebody who has another type of nurse. So it really works. So this idea then links to Laloux studied this, and he came up with this theory that organizational structures evolve over time. We have this impulsive, which is more like the wolf pack. It's all about fear and the leader, and it's a bit like drug gangs or something like this. That's red. You've got conformist yellow, which is more like the Catholic Church. You've got it's like a hierarchy. Achievement orange is your corporation, where you've got a goal. It's maybe generating value for shareholders or something like that. Pluralistic green, starting to bring in multi-stakeholders, and then evolutionary teal is the Buurtzorg thing. Now there's some romanticism here, agreed, and some people think this is just complete nonsense. Other people think it's amazing. I'm kind of maybe somewhere between the two, but what I would say is that within a guild we can be teal organization within a evolutionary teal organization within an achievement orange host company, and that can, because we can choose our microculture within the guild. What that means is it can accelerate the cultural transformation of the host organization, which I think is a fascinating thing. So we can be Google or Microsoft even though we might be working for Dunder Mifflin paper company. So that's the thing that's, I think, extremely exciting about guilds, because it is, after all, culture is only a state of mind after all. So case studies. First guild that I personally founded was the Cloud Engineers Guild. This was in September 2018. It ran for about 3 months. The backdrop is we had a number of cloud early adopters, those little coloured circles, including myself, and we were eclipsed by a massive program. And what happened is the massive program came afterwards, and it was a necessary piece of work. It was like a data center migration, but because it was data center migration to a cloud, it just eclipsed all of the cloud visionary early adopters. So we were scattered, basically. So the guild was a way of trying to even that out. So formally, it meant that a lot of these people couldn't organize and couldn't kind of develop a strategy because of this distortion effect. So within the guild, we just brought everybody together on equal footing, brought in some outside voices, and we're able to do the group sense making and understand why isn't this working for the visionaries, or what about the visionaries isn't working for the large project, and how could we settle our differences. And we were able to basically do that by taking it out of the formal organization and just having this weekly conversation about it over 3 months, and we were able to achieve some amazing things around building a new strategy. We had to wait a little bit before we could get that strategy actually into the mainstream, but we were able to achieve that, and we did all the groundwork actually in the informal guild rather than the formal organization. So and we then grew guilds to include non-technical areas. So we had a number of guilds around culture, one that's still going called Culture Corner. So before this, we had no real mechanism for people to just talk about culture and explore it. So we had a guild, and the idea is anybody could come, and it was facilitated. We had some outside speakers on neurodiversity and other things, and the idea was that everybody's an expert on culture, as you know, because it's a human thing. What we found is we were able to develop a lot of expertise within that group, and then we were able to take on a more formal role. We even ended up on this one to have with some C-suite participation. So we'd grown this from a grassroots under the radar thing all the way up to official footing C-suite over the period of about 18 months. And as I said, this one's still going. Another one we did was, and this was at Centrica, which I moved on from, but will be still going, Data Druids. So the Data Druids was really a marginalized community. We had some people who were very expert and passionate about their topic, which is around data governance and data management, but they were scattered by the org structure. And this allowed us to actually form a community where all the people who felt passionately about it could develop their ideas of what's working, what's not working, how can we influence things as a community. We didn't need to ask permission, that's the thing. All we needed was like an hour a week. So as long as people can find the time, we just basically did it ourselves. And that's the other interesting thing about guilds, is our experience is that it gives people some agency and some effectively empowerment at the grassroots level, because we don't have to go and ask somebody to create a guild, because all we need is, we just do it ourselves. We were supported by having a Microsoft Teams site, and each of the guilds was like a channel. And we had Teams chats for some of the guilds. Often the conversations would go on after the guild. We'd have a guild for an hour, and then we'd have like 50 comments in the chat afterwards, in the meeting chat, over a period of like 3 or 4 days afterwards. So it was a great way of actually catalyzing work. There were some lowlights. So sometimes we would work out what needed to be done, but it took a while to actually achieve that result. We had some issues with burnout. I got burnt out. I was like facilitating 10 sessions a week. After several months, I was absolutely exhausted. I needed to pull the plug on it. Sometimes I'd go to a session, nobody turn up. So, these things sometimes take a while. Yeah, they need to be understood over the longer term. We had a little bit of overselling as well. And we had some people just fundamentally did not buy into the guilds. We had some people who were loved them from the get-go. Other people who were just, it was not their thing, and they were not on board. They were never going to get on board. And it was just really, those were some of the lowlights. However, the highlights were amazing. We basically were able to create this collectivistic culture that ran alongside the formal culture, build these networks, challenge our perspectives, share knowledge. Official sponsorship came along. That was good in parts. It caused a few issues as well, because it's a bit like seeing a trend on the street like hip hop, and then you realize you can make some money out of it, and then sometimes you lose something in the process. So we found that a little bit, but there were some very good things about the official sponsorship. We ended up being a real a real center of influence within the organization. So the main highlight is we were able to change the cultural needle. We changed the culture of the organization doing this with literally no permission and no budget, apart from the nobody shut us down, and we were allowed these hour a week. So if somebody wanted to, any questions so far on that, Arthur?
Yes, actually, we've had a question. So you gave a couple of good examples of how you'd used guilds, but the question from Alan is, how widespread are guilds and these kinds of networks beyond the IT community, out in the business community?
Not as prevalent, to my knowledge, but there's no reason why not. But although then again, you could say, yes, they are prevalent. So for example, the example I gave about, if you consider a community practice, the British Medical Association is a community practice, then you could argue that yes, they are prevalent. There's loads of, any professional association in a sense is a guild.
Okay, and another point you made was about using Teams channels to share conversations within your guild. How about capturing and sharing knowledge so that you can make that explicit across a larger audience?
Yeah, I mean, we created collateral, so we would sense make work, and we worked on shared deliverables. So actually, some of the things started off being self-organizing and then became a bit more structured. So there was a guild we had around integration where we needed a strategy, and we ended up writing a strategy in the guild sessions. The early ones were about the sense making and working out what's going on here, what are the dynamics. Then over time, we just ended up turning, I suppose, it into a working group. So that's another thing. That's the nice thing about it, because it's up to us. We were able to repurpose that time during the week to make it maybe more formal where we needed to create an outcome and deliverable for further consumption.
That's excellent. Thanks. Can I just say to anybody else who's listening, please do add your questions into either the Q&A or the chat, whichever you feel more comfortable with, and we'll be dealing with those shortly. Please continue, Chris.
Thanks. These, by the way, if anybody's interested, I'm a Doré. These are Doré engravings from Dante's Inferno. So right, how would you get started? So if you have an organization, or if you have an interest, your passion, and you think you might want to run a guild, then you might want to talk to somebody who's done one already. I think this is true of, say, Agile. So I learned Agile by joining an already a high-performing Agile team and learning, rather than going on a training course. Nothing wrong with training courses, but I like seeing somebody who's already good at it and then learning by osmosis. So you might want to do that. That's something to think about. I would say one of my biggest tips is choose an area with conflict and tension. This powers the conversation, the dramatic tension. There's nothing worse than a guild about something, but it's all pretty settled and it mirrors the org structure perfectly. Then it just won't, it will be harder to actually get it to work. If the organization is, tying itself on knots over a certain topic, and some people think it should be X and some people think it should be Y, that's the ideal territory for guild. And almost the more dysfunctional a topic is, the better guilds work, because it's the tension that powers the conversation. It's like a narrative, like a book or a TV show. So as I said, it needs to be orthogonal typically to the formal org structure, because it's making up for the weaknesses, necessarily weaknesses, in any way of parceling up work and function. So when we did try and do guilds that were aligned perfectly to the organization, they didn't really work because it was just like a team meeting. So it was unnecessary. Starting small, I think, is a really good tip. Growing them organically, announcing them from the hills is not really the best policy. It's better to start it small with people who are really passionate and interested. And once it's established, bring in other voices, maybe dissenting voices and things like that. If it starts off with loads of dissenting voices and loads of people who've been persuaded to go, but they don't really want to, it will just tank immediately. And then people say, well, the guilds don't work. So it's a matter of actually trying to treat it like a kindling a forest fire, in a damp wood, particularly if you've got some real challenges. You need to dry out some of your kindling, find some moss, You know, you don't want to put on the big log straight away, basically, and be patient, because some of the beneficial effects took you know, a couple of weeks. Some of them took 6 months. They're having some type of creed or manifesto, so is useful. So I used to say at the beginning of each Cloud Engineers Guild session, welcome to the Cloud Engineers Guild. I'm a cloud engineer, you're a cloud engineer, we're all cloud engineers. Leave all other job titles, pay grades and egos at the door. So you don't have to do that, but saying something, getting some idea of, look, this is different, this is a guild, this isn't a normal meeting, can be very, very helpful. After a few years, I got a bit lazy and I stopped that. And actually we had some problems because of that, because people were not really obeying the rules. So having some type of creed is important. Values, I really like the idea of values in the form of the Agile Manifesto. So it's one over the other. They're both important. So independence over formal alignment of the organization. Both are good, but choose independence maybe. Diversity and inclusion over formal teams. Growing collective practice over individual excellence. Very important. Taking initiative over asking permission. That's the great thing about it. As I said, all you need is an hour a week and some people are enthusiasts, and then you just grow it. You know, you know, beg forgiveness rather than asking permission, you know, and do it under the radar maybe, and then come out into the open once it's already thriving. So leading these things, you know, facilitation I think is important. I often, when I facilitate guild sessions, I get the party started, I welcome people, maybe state the creed, get the party started, rather like a psychotherapist, let's talk about grief, you know, on a whiteboard, something like that. And then I just shut up and I just listen and see, you know, I let the room kind of get the silence, and then people will chip in, and then suddenly it will just start going, and then I'll just intervene occasionally rather than trying to control the meeting, you know. So I really, what I'm looking for is me not to be controlling the conversation. I want, if somebody's, you know, if Marilyn's spoken, I would prefer it if Kylie spoke next than me having to say, Kylie, have you got anything to say? So to try and avoid me imposing myself, you know, to try and make it collective as possible. That's a little bit artificial. Sometimes it does fall apart and you need somebody to be able to pick it up. But you know, to try and, you know, allow it to find its own center, I suppose. Balancing share of voice, dealing with now some people will take advantage of that format. You can get some people who maybe aren't comfortable with silence, or people who have got an axe to grind, or a very strong personality, or a very deep subject matter expert. They sometimes will dominate. That sometimes is appropriate, but oftentimes it's not appropriate. So actually the hardest job for me as a facilitator is to temper those strong voices. We still want them to come, but we don't want the same people to speak every week. We want to kind of have it more collectivistic. So I think hosting good dinner party, we want everybody to kind of come away with a really good feeling. So in conclusion then, what I would say, this is a quote again from a biologist and a fungi expert. Again, this is from my latest reading, and this is from Toby Kears, and it's really, there's nice bit of, I'm from Hampshire, so this is a nice little Hampshire scene here. But the quote that Toby's really making, collaboration is always an alloy of competition and cooperation. Beautiful quote. I think really what I'm saying with guilds then is that organizations and any human endeavor involves an awful lot of collaboration. Often competition is emphasized, and maybe guilds are a way of bringing back some balance with some cooperation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Chris. So we have 8 minutes for questions. We've dealt with a couple already, and there's a couple more coming in. Anybody else who wishes to raise a question, please use the Q&A box or the chat box if you prefer. Kylie has asked us, Chris, what was it that was your original impetus for establishing a guild? What sparked this whole idea?
It was that, thank you, Kylie. So the impetus for me was that I could see that people weren't understanding each other from their diverse perspectives within a siloed organization undergoing significant amounts of change around cloud computing. So I realized the problem was almost an empathy, it was an empathy wall. And again, I'll unpack that a little bit. So, Ali Russell Hochschild, the sociologist, has done a lot of work around empathy, but it's really empathy, as we know, is about trying to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. And what I found is people weren't really doing that. They were following rules. It goes back to the point that David made. David, what was the term you used? It was pathological compliance or something like that. This idea of malicious compliance. People were following the rules. The rules didn't work for certain communities, and nobody was solving that particular problem. So it was really somebody needed to actually bring those parties together to explore it more deeply. And that wasn't surprising because there was an enormous amount of change. So you've got an organization with a certain amount of fragmentation and silos, and you've got this enormous amount of wholesale change coming in from cloud computing, and people weren't understanding each other, they weren't empathizing with each other, and therefore they weren't trusting each other. So I recognized the problem. I had skin in the game because I was one of the people who was involved in cloud, and I thought, I know what's needed. We need to just take some time out and explore each other's perspectives.
That's fantastic. It seems like it was extremely successful at doing that as well. Okay, so other questions that we've had come in, please do write into the chat or the Q&A if anybody else has more questions. So Alan's asked that you referred to evidence that nursing outcomes are improved by guilds, but if you're putting these guilds into a commercial organization, have you got any evidence that guilds improve profitability?
Okay, so the nursing example, it wasn't guild so much, but it was an example of self-organization. So in terms of profitability, I would say that yes. So the theme of the conference is around automating value, and what we found around cloud is we were missing opportunities for automation. And some of the opportunities for automation were being missed because the decision makers were more from an operational side than from a development side. And to actually unleash the value of cloud, we needed more automation. That required a developer perspective. The decision makers didn't have that because they come from an operational world. So we were able to bring that developer perspective in and then turn it into language that would allow the operational people to buy in and get on board. So we were able to unleash efficiency savings and time savings and actually, making things more orderly through automation, facilitated by a lot of the work that we'd done in the guilds, and both to develop the IP, if you like, but also then to take people through and explain it. So a good example would be around, say, site reliability engineering function, DevOps, and things like that, which were disciplines that were there was a certain amount of friction between those disciplines and ITIL. There was a lot of value in DevOps, even if people didn't want to do DevOps, just using DevOps technology to automate some of the ITIL tasks. The two communities had to be brought together to unlock the value and increase the performance and profitability of the organization. The guilds played a large part. They weren't the only thing, but they played a large part in bringing those communities together.
Okay, that sounds really great. From Sam, not a question, but he just wanted to say thank you so much for a really interesting session, Chris. And also you've got some thanks from the past. So Sue thanked you for a brilliant presentation and has said that at Centrica, they're still indebted to you for the Guildcraft that you introduced there. It's still going strong. So obviously it did have a very dramatic effect.
Yeah, thank you. So the Sam's a she. Hi, Sam. Hi, Sue. So I think the thing I would say then is that human interaction is something that is shaped through our lives. if you take because I've got a little bit of time, so if you take Tom Wujek, Build a Tower, Build a Team, there's a great TED talk. If you take the spaghetti and marshmallow game, where you've got to build a tower and put a marshmallow on top, preschool children outperform MBA graduates at that group task. Yeah. So the interesting thing is people are actually good at group behavioral dynamics, and then we go to school, and then we go to work, and we're told that this Taylorist, this is what you do, and this is who tells you to do it, and it's unnatural. So I think the main thing that I've discovered is that it's not really, I haven't created something. All I've done is I've observed that these are constructs, and we can choose to use them, but we can also choose to put them aside and work in these more naturalistic ways that are really part of our part of our, their birthright as being a person. I already have these skills innately. We all do. So, Guildcraft is just maybe a way of unlocking them.
Okay, great. So we've got a couple more questions if we can manage to just squeeze them in. David wants to know how, you mentioned earlier about having management support, but how have you found acceptance of guilds by management? So if the management expects hierarchies to be the way things go, can they accept the idea that you're forming these sub-teams?
I don't think that I question that statement. I think basically more modern types of management and individuals that kind of are into that sort of thing, they get it, and they're normally very, very enthusiastic. Some probably a minority of people in the organization at the senior levels weren't really into it, but I would say they were actually the exception rather than rule. What I'm talking about here is very well backed by modern practices, science. If you look at Harvard Business Review, a lot of this stuff is very topical, and I have a habit of stumbling into things that are kind of topical and fashionable. But this is the reason it's topical and fashionable, is there's a lot of value. Yes, people will romanticize it and they'll take it too far, but it is just common sense, really, isn't it? And I would say that the overwhelming reaction at the senior levels was support.
That's really good to hear. So if there is somebody who's looking to establish guilds, then Kylie's asking, is there any kind of training or guidance that's available to people to assist them in doing this?
Well, people are welcome to reach out to me. I mean, it's my pet topic. I'm kind of started writing something, writing a few words, writing a book. I mean, I've done a load of blogs, but I blog about all sorts of crazy stuff as well. But specifically about guilds, I am writing something at the moment, but I haven't actually committed to actually getting it all down, but that's something that I'm planning on doing, and having a little book. But I mean what I would say is that if you can join one, that's great. But yeah, I mean it's a very good question. It's something I need to give more further thought, because I think there is a need. I mean, there's loads of other people working in this space, around new ways of working, and this is really just another leg to that particular table, I suppose.
Okay, well, so if you're the go-to person for some of this, is there somewhere that you can ask people to go to, somewhere on Twitter or blog or something?
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn is probably the best way of getting in touch with me. And my LinkedIn details were just basically I'm Positive Disruptor.